The Sicilian School was a small community of Sicilian, and to a lesser extent, mainland Italian poets gathered around Frederick II, most of them belonging to his court, the Magna Curia. Headed by Giacomo da Lentini, they produced more than 300 poems of courtly love between 1230 and 1266, the experiment being continued after Frederick's death by his son, Manfred. Origins. These poets drew inspiration from the troubadour poetry of Occitania written in langue d'oc, which applied the feudal code of honor to the relation between a man and a woman. This is a reversal of the traditional role of women, traditionally dependent on men, and marks a new awareness in medieval society. The decadence of feudalism with the increasing power of the middle class causes a shift in the reading public, the epic gradually giving way to the lyric. In the lower Middle Ages, more and more women were reading books than ever before, and poetry tried to adapt to their point of view and the newly acquired role in society. This features French poetry, then very influential in Italy. What distinguishes the Sicilian school from the troubadours, however, is the introduction of a kinder, gentler type of woman than that found in the French models, one who was nearer to Dante's Madonnas and Petrarch's Laura, though much less characterized psychologically. The poems of the Sicilians hardly portray real women or situations, but the style and language are remarkable, since the Sicilians created the first Italian literary standard by enriching the existing vernacular base, probably inspired by popular love songs, with new words of Latin and Provençal origin. The work of a roving school, it is lyric poetry to be in the forefront of literature, inspiring a widespread enthusiasm whose effects will be felt for centuries. The initial boost given by the Sicilian poets from the Swift's court, the first to use a standardized vernacular to make art poetry, will be passed on to many others, and all of them, not just the pedantic imitators of the Siculo-Tuscan school but also Ghineselli, the poets of Dolce Stil Novo, and more widely all writers of verse, will have to deal, though by different degrees, with the Sicilian models, so that some peculiarities will be assimilated into standard usage of Italian poetry. Quote, though yet confined to a few notaries and dignitaries of the emperors, such poetry shows for the first time uniform linguistic traits and a richness in vocabulary far exceeding that of the Sicilian language by which it was inspired. The Magna Curia was not based in any given city, but always moving across southern Italy, a fact which helped the school avoid the temptation of choosing any local dialect as the starting point for the new language. That is why the new standard was a Cone language, a melting pot of many different vernaculars. The reason for moving from city to city was mainly political. Although his experiment was short-lived, Frederick successfully created the first modern state in Europe, run by an efficient bureaucracy. Its members were neither appointed from the aristocracy nor the clergy, with good reason, since the former were far more interested in defending their own privileges than the welfare of the country, and often plotted against him in the hope of regaining the power, while the latter were basically faithful to the Pope, his biggest enemy. Frederick was in fact dismantling the feudal system of government inherited from the Normans. His Magna Curia and minor dignitaries were usually chosen from lay orders. He also abolished internal barriers. Free trade brought prosperity to the south, making Bari one of the richest cities in the Mediterranean. But, keeping this modern state afloat meant that his barons had no power to collect taxes, the greatest source of revenues. Hence the necessity for Frederick to bring law and order by moving his court to and through style and subject matter. Though the Sicilian school is generally considered conventional in theme or content, it rather stands out for his refined lexicon, near to the style of Trobarclus, and for the wise treatment of figures of speech and metaphors of style novistic taste taken from natural philosophy. There is a visible move towards Neoplatonic models, which will be embraced by Dolce Stil Novo in the later 13th century Bologna and Florence, and more markedly by Petrarch. Unlike the northern Italian troubadours, no line is ever written in Occitan. Rather, the Occitan repertoire of chivalry terms is adapted to the Siculo-Italian phonetics and morphology, so that new Italian words are actually coined, some adapted, but none really loaned. A most famous specimen is Immagio Posto in Cor by Giacomo da Lentini, who apparently inspired the movement. Giacomo da Lentini is also widely credited by scholars for inventing the sonnet, a literary form later perfected by Dante and, most of all, Petrarch. He uses it in a number of poems. We quote here the most famous that probably inspired the whole school, The Limitations of Sicilian Poetry. The main inhibiting factor on Sicilian poetry was probably the political censorship imposed by Frederick. Literary debate was confined to courtly love. In this respect, the poetry of the North, though stuck to the Langsdoil, provided fresher blood for satire. The North was fragmented into communes or little city-states which had a relatively democratic self-government, and that is precisely why the Cervantes genre, and later, Dante's Divina Commedia and sonnets were so popular. They referred to real people and feelings, though often idealized like Beatrice. As Cervantes is in effect eminently political, it usually refers to real battles and attacks real military or political enemies, the author often being the soldier of the night involved in the strife, as in Giton d'Arezzo's Rota di Monteperti, a bloody battle where Manfred of Sicily, Frederick's son, defeated the Guelphs. Dante himself will commemorate the event in the Commedia many years later, where, mindful of the political strife that had him exiled, he will attack many princes and popes, such as Boniface VIII, one of his biggest personal enemies. Frederick's censorship is also apparent from the structure of the song. The Sicilians transformed the tornado, the strophe which in troubadour poetry contains a dedication to a famous person, with a congedo, where the poet bids goodbye to his reader and asks the song to bear his message to his lady. The reshaping of the Occitan model also involved the suppression of music. The authors were great readers and translators, but apparently could not play any instrument, so the work was intended for reading, which called for logical unity, posing a question, proposing, and finding a solution in the end. That meant no interchangeable lines as in troubadour poetry and fewer repetitions. For a French jungler who sang his poems these were necessary, but they sounded redundant to the Sicilian authors. The poetry was music to the eye, not to the ear, and the legacy is also apparent in Dante and Petrarch's lyrics. The sonnet is even more exacting on this point. The separation between the octave and the sestet is purely a logical one, the rhymes drawing a visual line between the first and last part. However, the fact that Italian poetry was being made for the reading public may have facilitated its circulation. Realism and parody. Cielo del Carmo. Though lyric poetry prevailed at Frederick's court, it is at this time that we have an interesting exception in Rosa Fresca or Lentissima, widely known as contrasto and attributed to Cielo del Carmo, about which modern critics have much exercised themselves. This contrasto is written in a Sicilian language close to that spoken in the city of Messina, with several influences differences from continental Italian variants. The subject is a humorous fight between two young lovers, a kind of poetry quite common in the Middle Ages. It is about a young suitor who sneaks into the garden of a young lady from a rich Sicilian family and secretly declares his love to her. He then tries to seduce the girl with his one-liners. She berates him for his ill intentions and keeps him at bay to protect her honor. But her prudeness proves eventually to be just a love game. She gives in completely to his bold advances. However, the language uses much of the courtly language of lyric poetry, and the result is a parody of the Sicilian School's clichés. The contrasto belongs to the time of the Emperor Frederick II, and is also important as a proof that there once existed a popular, independent of literary poetry prior to Frederick's times. Now, most critics agree that the contrasto of Cielo del Carmo is probably a scholarly re-elaboration of some lost popular song. It is perhaps the closest to a kind of poetry that has perished or which was smothered by the Sicilian literature of Frederick's. Its distinguishing feature was its hilarity and down-to-earthness as opposed to the abstract verse of the Sicilian school. But it has been argued that its style betrays a profound knowledge of Frederick's movement, and some critics have hinted the man who penned it must have been acquainted with or even been part of the court itself. Given the highly satiric and erotic vein, Cielo del Carmo may well be a fictitious name. His contrasto shows vigor and freshness in the expression of feelings. Such low treatment of the love theme shows that its subject matter is certainly popular. This poem sounds real and spontaneous, marked as it is by the sensuality characteristic of the people of southern Italy. Members: Cielo del Carmo, Pier del Vin, Ingifredi, Stefano Protonotaro, Otto del Colon, Rinaldo d'Aquino, Jacopo Mostacci, Giacomino Pugliese, Giacomo da Lentini, Arrigo Testa, Mazzeo Ricco, Pisse Valdoria, Frederick II, Manfred of Sicily, King Enzo, Ruggieri d'Amici, Guido del Colon.